China says it's open to talks, but no one's calling. Strange, isn't it? In a world where just one tweet can move global markets and a single statement can spark diplomatic tensions, you'd think a simple phone call between two of the most powerful nations would be happening more often. But it's not. And that silence, intentional or not, speaks volumes. Hi, I'm glad you're here, because today we're going to unpack one of the most quietly complex questions in U.S. foreign policy. Why isn't China picking up the phone? What's really happening behind all the formal press releases and vague statements about mutual respect and equality? Now, if you've been following U.S.-China relations for a while, you know it's never just about tariffs or tweets. There's a deeper dance going on, one that involves pride, history, culture, and power. And when both sides are misreading the rhythm, no one leads, no one follows. They just stall. So here's the big question. What does it really take to get Beijing to the table? Not just symbolically, but sincerely. What are we missing in our approach? And what can we learn from how these negotiations keep falling apart? Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to go deeper than headlines. We'll explore how words matter more than you might think, why China is frustrated with the U.S.'s mixed messaging, and how Donald Trump's personal style, love it or hate it, completely changed the rules of engagement. This isn't a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about systems, signals, and the real cost of miscommunication. Stick with me, because by the end, you might see diplomacy not as something that happens behind closed doors, but as something that reflects who we are, what we value, and how we choose to show up on the world stage. What does mutual respect really mean, especially when it comes from Beijing? It sounds simple, doesn't it? Like something you'd hear in any healthy relationship. But in diplomacy, phrases like mutual respect and equality aren't just polite formalities. They're loaded with history, intention, and sometimes contradiction. When Chinese officials say they're open to dialogue based on mutual respect, what they're often signaling is this: we'll talk, but not if you criticize us publicly, question our internal decisions, or treat us like the junior partner in this conversation. It's not about tone, it's about control. Let me give you an example. Back in 2018, during the height of U.S.-China trade tensions, the Trump administration imposed tariffs and made strong statements about China's intellectual property practices. In response, China walked away from the table, citing a lack of sincerity and disrespect. But what they really meant was they felt cornered, not necessarily economically, but politically. Public pressure and condemnation made it hard for Chinese leaders to appear strong at home and flexible abroad. And in their system, losing face isn't just inconvenient, it's unacceptable. From a U.S. perspective, though, mutual respect often means openness, transparency, and the ability to speak honestly, even critically, without risking the relationship. That's part of the democratic DNA. Debate is healthy, dissent is allowed, and dialogue is how we work things out. And that's where the clash begins. To me, this is more than just a diplomatic language barrier. It's a deep values mismatch. I think sometimes, as Americans, we assume that if we're being clear and direct, we're being respectful. But in many parts of the world, including China, that same approach can feel confrontational or even humiliating. So while we believe we're laying out facts, they may hear it as an attack. And that's a recipe for deadlock. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. should walk on eggshells. Transparency matters. Accountability matters. But if we truly want productive dialogue, we have to understand how the other side hears us, not just how we speak. Because respect, in practice, isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. It's cultural, it's situational, and in high-stakes diplomacy, it can make or break the entire negotiation. And that brings us to something just as crucial. What happens when the message itself gets scrambled, even before it reaches the other side? That's where we're headed next. The power of mixed signals, and why China doesn't just want a conversation. They want consistency. Let's talk about that. Sometimes it's not the deal on paper that breaks the negotiation, it's the words spoken around it. We often think of diplomacy as a matter of strategy, economics, and formal agreements. But what if I told you that one offhand remark, just a few sentences, could undo months of careful talks? That's exactly what's been happening between the US and China. You see, while trade policies and military posturing get the headlines, Beijing has been quietly watching and reacting to the rhetoric coming out of Washington. And not just from the president. Cabinet members, advisors, even spokespeople have played a role in shaping how China perceives the US negotiating posture. Take Peter Navarro, for example, Trump's trade advisor at the time. He often described China as a strategic enemy and accused it of economic aggression. To many Americans, especially those frustrated with manufacturing loss or intellectual property theft, that kind of language might feel justified, even honest. But in the eyes of Chinese leadership, those weren't just strong opinions, they were public humiliation. This is where things get complicated. China as a nation is extremely sensitive to how it's portrayed on the global stage. It's not just about ego, it's about legacy, national pride, and internal legitimacy. The Communist Party doesn't want to appear weak or reactive. So when American officials make disparaging statements, even outside the context of formal talks, Beijing sees it as a violation of that mutual respect we talked about earlier. It creates a paradox. The U.S. values free speech and a diversity of viewpoints, especially from within its own government. But China wants to know exactly who speaks for the administration, and that whoever is speaking does so with restraint. Here's what I think. This is one of the most underappreciated tensions in U.S.-China relations. Because while we might debate policies at home on cable news and Twitter, China interprets those messages as official, even if they're not. It's a case of different political cultures interpreting the same information through vastly different lenses. So what's the result? Talks stall, trust erodes, and what could have been a practical negotiation turns into a standoff over tone and language. To move forward, it's not about silencing debate, but about coordinating the message. China doesn't just want engagement, it wants coherence. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the absence of a clear voice from the U.S. side. Let's explore why China isn't just looking for a conversation, but for someone they can reliably talk to. Have you ever tried negotiating with someone only to realize you're not actually sure who you're negotiating with? That's the exact frustration China has been facing when dealing with the United States, especially during the Trump years. From Beijing's perspective, diplomacy is supposed to be clear, centralized, and above all, predictable. In China's political system, there's no confusion about who speaks for the government. Orders flow top-down. Messages are disciplined. When a Chinese diplomat speaks, they speak with the full authority of the state. Now contrast that with what was happening in Washington. One day, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin would say the U.S. was making progress with China and that a deal was close. The next day, Peter Navarro, President Trump's trade hawk, would go on TV and accuse China of manipulating its currency and cheating the U.S. economy. Then you'd have Larry Kudlow trying to calm markets with reassuring statements, only to be immediately undercut by a fiery tweet from Trump himself. From the outside looking in, it seemed like every branch of the administration had its own version of the truth. And from China's standpoint, that was maddening. Because how do you commit to a deal? How do you even begin negotiating if you don't know which message to trust, or worse, who's really in charge? In Chinese diplomacy, this kind of inconsistency isn't just frustrating, it's destabilizing. It undermines credibility, it breaks down trust. They want to deal with someone who's authorized, aligned with leadership, and won't be contradicted an hour later on social media. To be honest, I can't blame them. Imagine running a multi-billion-dollar negotiation and constantly wondering if today's agreement will be tomorrow's reversal. That's not diplomacy, that's roulette. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. should mirror China's centralized structure. Our system is different, and in many ways that's our strength. But in international negotiations, especially with nations that value clarity over debate, we can't afford to speak with 5 different voices and expect to be taken seriously. In my view, this was one of the biggest blind spots in the Trump administration's approach to China. They had strong positions, yes, but no single consistent messenger. And without that, even good ideas struggled to gain traction. But this problem doesn't stop with personalities. It reveals something deeper, a mismatch in negotiation culture and expectations. So next, let's dig into that cultural contrast, the fast, individual-driven style of U.S. negotiations versus China's methodical, institutional approach, and why that difference changes everything. They called him the deal maker, the guy who could walk into a room, cut through the noise, and walk out with a handshake that changed everything. But when it comes to international diplomacy, especially with a country like China, can that style really work? Donald Trump's approach to negotiation was deeply personal. He often bypassed traditional diplomatic channels, preferring to speak leader to leader, man to man. In some ways, that was refreshing. It felt direct, human, even bold. He believed in the power of chemistry and gut instinct over bureaucracy and briefing papers. But here's the problem. Global diplomacy doesn't always work like real estate. When Trump tweeted about tariffs at 2 a.m., markets shifted before his staff had even seen the message. When he praised Xi Jinping one day and threatened him the next, it wasn't just confusing. It was destabilizing. For allies, for adversaries, for the very people trying to negotiate on his behalf. In the context of China, this unpredictability had a particular sting. Because Chinese leadership, structured, cautious, and deeply hierarchical, values long-term strategy over short-term drama. They don't like surprises. They don't trust volatility. And they definitely don't respond well to being publicly pressured or insulted. So when Trump changed his tone on a whim or contradicted his own team, it wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as chaos. And let's be honest, China isn't just reacting to what Trump says. They're studying what it means. They're reading the signals. When they don't see discipline in messaging, they don't see unity. And if they don't see unity, they question whether any agreement will last beyond a tweet or a press conference. Personally, I think Trump's instincts to shake up the system, to challenge old assumptions, had merit. He was right that the U.S. needed to get tougher on China. Many Americans agreed with that. But in diplomacy, instincts need structure. Boldness needs backup. And deals, especially with China, need to be followed through with consistency and clarity. It's like this. You can't just throw the rule book out if you don't have a better one to replace it. And in the absence of process, what was left was confusion. Sometimes intimidation, and often distrust. Now, to be fair, Trump wasn't the first U.S. president to struggle with China. But his style put a spotlight on a larger issue. The way our systems of leadership and negotiation are fundamentally different. And that brings us right into our next topic, not just the who, but the how. How America and China approach negotiation and why those two styles are often speaking entirely different languages. Let's get into it. What happens when two people walk into a room speaking the same language, but with completely different definitions of what a deal even means? That's exactly what's been happening between the United States and China. And the clash isn't just about policies or politics, it's about culture. American negotiation style tends to be fast, personality-driven, and centered around short-term wins. It's dynamic, often improvisational. There's a belief that if the two people at the top can just figure it out, everything else will fall into place. We've seen this play out time and time again, especially under Trump, who believed that leadership chemistry was the ultimate leverage. China, on the other hand, takes a long-game view. Negotiations are slow, layered, and deeply institutional. They prepare for months, sometimes years, before making a move. And once they do, every detail is scripted, coordinated, and backed by a clear hierarchy. Nothing is accidental, nothing is improvised. Let's look at two moments in history. In 1972, when Nixon visited Mao Zedong in Beijing, it wasn't just about opening diplomatic doors. That visit was years in the making. Carefully managed by Henry Kissinger behind the scenes, it represented a shift in the entire geopolitical landscape. But even then, it was China's leadership structure. One voice, one message that shaped the terms of engagement. Fast forward to 2018 through 2020. Trump meets Xi Jinping. There's a lull of pageantry, handshakes, smiles, tweets calling Xi a great friend. But behind the scenes, American messages kept changing. One day the deal was close. The next day, tariffs were going up. Meanwhile, China responded with calm silence or vague, non-committal statements, because in their eyes, the U.S. wasn't negotiating. It was performing. And here's where it gets personal for me. I've worked with people from both cultures, and I've seen this pattern play out in everything from business to government. Americans often view efficiency as speed, but in many parts of the world, including China, efficiency is about precision. It's not how fast you move, it's how thoroughly you think before acting. So when Trump or his advisors pushed for quick wins, China saw that as sloppy. And when China took months to respond to proposals, Washington saw that as stalling. In reality, neither side was trying to disrespect the other, but they weren't speaking the same negotiation language. And that's why deals faltered. Not because the issues were unsolvable, but because the process itself was misunderstood. Which brings us to something even bigger than style or strategy, something that affects not just U.S.-China relations, but the entire world economy. Let's zoom out and talk about the broader consequences of this disconnect, how it ripples through global markets, and what it means for the future. Here's something that often gets overlooked in the headlines. While everyone's focused on who said what, or whether China picked up the phone this week, the bigger story is happening behind the scenes. Because diplomacy, it's never just two men in a room shaking hands. It's markets reacting, it's factories adjusting, it's families wondering how the price of goods will shift next month. Let's zoom out. The trade war between the US and China sent ripple effects across the global economy. Tariffs didn't just raise prices at home, they disrupted supply chains, created uncertainty for businesses, and rattled investor confidence worldwide. Think about it. When two of the world's largest economies go head-to-head, everyone from a soybean farmer in Iowa to a tech manufacturer in Taiwan feels the shockwaves. But that's not all. What happens abroad is deeply shaped by what's happening here at home. One angle that's rarely talked about enough is how domestic U.S. politics plays into diplomacy. Presidents don't negotiate in a vacuum. They're under pressure from Congress, from lobbyists, and from voters. And in Trump's case, public perception often shaped foreign policy decisions more than strategic consistency. Remember when markets dipped sharply after a Trump tweet, only for his team to backtrack the next day? That wasn't just a communication slip. It reflected the tug of war between political posturing and actual policy. And that's part of the reason diplomacy with China is so difficult. While Beijing comes to the table with a long-term strategy and a united front, Washington sometimes shows up with multiple messages, shaped by competing voices back home. Now here's my take. This isn't just about getting a deal or not. It's about realizing that international diplomacy today is interconnected with economics, domestic politics, and even social trust. We can't treat these negotiations like a poker game with winners and losers. Because when diplomacy breaks down, it's not just politicians who suffer. It's real people on both sides of the Pacific. So the next time you hear that China's not picking up the phone, ask yourself, what else might be happening that's bigger than the call itself? Coming up next, we'll pull everything together and look at what it all means for you and how we can avoid sleepwalking into another Cold War. Let's wrap this up in the final section. So let's take a step back. Throughout this video, we've unpacked why China isn't taking Washington's calls. Not because they're ignoring us, but because the signals are mixed, the words are sharp, and the trust is thin. We've seen how something as simple as a phrase like mutual respect can mean vastly different things depending on who's saying it. We've explored how one offhand remark by a U.S. official can derail months of quiet progress. And we've looked at how clashing negotiation styles, domestic political noise, and global markets all collide to shape what we call diplomacy. This isn't just about foreign policy, it's about the language of power and how easily it can be misread. So what can we take away from this? If we want to avoid stumbling into another Cold War, it starts with recognizing that real diplomacy goes beyond personality. It requires clarity, consistency, patience, and maybe most of all, the humility to understand that listening is just as important as speaking. Here's my question to you. What kind of international leadership do you want to see in 2025? One that talks tough for the cameras, or one that gets things done behind the scenes? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. If this video made you think differently, hit that like button. And if you want more breakdowns like this, don't forget to subscribe and share. Because next time, we're diving into how Trump's 2025 economic vision could reshape the global balance of power and what it means for your future. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.